From Kadesh, the Israelites journeyed by the way of the Red Sea to encompass the land of Edom. They went south and then turned north through past Petra, through Moab, and up to a place called Heshbon, opposite Jericho. And there they crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. And the shading is supposed to represent the country they are thought to have occupied during the first century or so they were there. You remember that the way distressed the people because it was hard. And from the air we can get a small idea of it. This is Akabah, a village of mud huts. And this, north of it, is the pilgrim route they must have struck, now a railway. It was the bridges of this railway that Colonel Lawrence blew up so assiduously in the Great War. North of that, they came to Petra. Now there's no doubt there was a civilization at Petra in their time, although these temples were carved out of the red sandstone rock about 1,000 years later. You remember that Petra has been described as the rose-red city, half as old as time. North of that, they would have had their first hazy view of the Promised Land. Hazy because of the chemicals from the Dead Sea, which rise to a great height. And there in the distance are the hills of Judea. And on the east of that sea, on these mountains, Moses died. The Valley of Shittim is the lower half of the Jordan Valley between Jericho and the Dead Sea. As Genesis describes it, it is a volcanic plain full of slime pits and is still used by the Bedouin as a meeting place where they gather before crossing the Jordan every year into Palestine. For 2 or 3 days they come down there with their families and flocks and herds and camp on the river bank, waiting until they're collected before they cross. Then the horsemen and the camels going first, they cross over using all the many fords there are in that district. You'll see that the foals always run loose by their horses. Here are the families coming down. Now they're bringing the sheep down to the bank, and in a minute you'll see how they take them across. There's another foal running loose. The camels are sometimes a nuisance because at the sight of so much water they are apt to run amok and have been known to be lost for 3 days or more. All these herds, as a matter of fact, were got across quite safely. The Jordan's not very wide, nowhere more than 30 or 40 yards, but it flows swiftly. And here they are taking the sheep across, holding them by the ears. They go downstream in the shallows, and then when they get to the deep water, they swim across, still holding the sheep by the ears. The women and children go across on rafts made of goat skins blown up with air and joined together by poles. There are some Assyrian inscriptions of these rafts, which shows you how old they are. And now the camels are getting towards the other side. It takes 2 or 3 days for a big tribe to cross the Jordan, and the Israelites must have taken much longer, although no doubt the young men armed crossed in a single day. Once across the Jordan, the Israelites would have found themselves in a dead flat plain about 5 miles long, leading up to the Oasis of Jericho. There you can see the oasis, that black streak under the mountains in the right of the picture. And it is said that Joshua had 40,000 men with which to attack the city. But today, archaeologists believe that Jericho never in its history withstood a siege, and that about this time its walls were destroyed by an earthquake. In a minute under the mountains, you'll see the remains of the city which Joshua took. There it is, that mound in the top of the picture. Those are the remains of the walls which were destroyed by an earthquake. And in thinking of the Promised Land, you mustn't compare it to England or Europe, but to the desert of Sinai through which we have just come. And then perhaps you'll see why it seemed to them a land of milk and honey. And so they began to settle. The camels which they had used for fighting were turned to the plough. And ploughing is another instance of the minute accuracy of the Bible, when it says, "He that putteth his hand to the plough." Because in Palestine, the peasant ploughs with one hand, and in the other holds the goad. You can see the man holding the goad here. It must have taken the Israelites several generations to settle down, and the same process goes on today. These people here had only been settled about 20 years, and their methods of agriculture were the most primitive. Each year they scratched a new piece of ground and simply grew as much corn as they needed, and then next year they'd move on again to another piece of ground. And you can see how primitive their methods are. There's no doubt that this is the sort of life the Israelites led under the early judges, probably up to the time of Gideon. These women are gleaning just as Ruth must have gleaned in the fields of Boaz. In time, they would have learned to live in villages built of mud with mud plaster like this. The houses inside are very primitive with no furniture at all, and the mud looks white under the sun. The orchards are mostly apple, olive, and almond. That's almond blossom. And the vines grow on the ground like this. And then in time also they would have learned to use the Canaanite cities as markets. And the scene must have been very much what it is now, when the peasants and Bedouin go in once a week to market. This man here is having his camel saddlebag filled with wool. Here's a general scene of the market, a great deal of talking, but not very much buying. The pots haven't changed, notably, in color or size since the time of Abraham. But besides learning to settle, the Israelites had to continue to fight. And the scene of most of their battles is this great plain of Esdraelon, which cuts the country in half. Now try and get the geography of it in your mind. On the left are the mountains of Gilboa. In the center, Mount Shunem. And to the north, coming into the picture in the distance on the right, Mount Tabor. And this plain was garrisoned by Egyptian and Canaanite cavalry, probably camel cavalry. And as the Israelites had no cavalry, they were in danger of being separated, the tribes in the north from the tribes in the south. Sisera, who is thought to have been an Egyptian, had his headquarters at this great fortress of Meggido, which dominates the western end of the plain. And from there his bands went out marauding the fields and the villages of the Israelites, so that in the end Deborah and Barak were forced to gather the tribes to resist him. And they chose Mount Tabor for their headquarters. And you can see what an impregnable fortress it would have made in time of retreat, and how the steepness of its slopes must have given the impetus of an avalanche to Barak's charge when he made it. From Mount Tabor, he and his men would have watched the army of Sisera sweeping up the valley of the Kishon. And as they watched, there must have come up suddenly one of those thunderstorms which are so common in that country, and then the horses, frightened by the thunder and lightning, would have been put to final confusion by Barak's charge of the 10,000 men. While we were in Syria, we encountered just such a cloudburst as must have happened that day. It only rained for half an hour, but in that time great rocks and trees were hurled down into the valley, and what a few moments before had been miles of smiling fields and orchards became a morass several feet deep in mud. And it must have been in a bog just such as this, suddenly made, that Sisera's army perished. The chief battlefield, however, of the Israelites was Mount Gilboa. Here you see another view of it, and just underneath in those woods is the well where Gideon chose his men. There in that wood there, it's since been planted up by a Jewish colony. And this plain in front is where the Midianites were encamped, whom he attacked.